2,000 years ago, a message was born. A message of good news to all people. This message was delivered by the greatest man to ever live, and was fulfilled in his life, death, and resurrection. But just a few years after the message was born, a great threat was born alongside it. The threat promised to eliminate the message, but instead experienced it, becoming its most powerful messenger. This is the story of how that threat was transformed, and how he became one of the most influential men who ever lived. Tarsus had always been a busy place. It was a trading hub for most of history, conquered by Alexander the Great, then captured by Rome. The Cilician pirates quickly cowered before Roman might, and the city was promptly made the capital of Cilicia. This strategic and powerful city gave birth to a strategic and powerful man. Saul of Tarsus, a man devoted to his craft, circumcised on the 8th day, and hailing from the tribe of Benjamin. The ultimate Hebrew of Hebrews, quickly surpassed his associates and found himself a rising star among the Pharisees of his time. His intelligence was remarkable, second only to his loyalty. But unfortunately for Saul, the nation he swore loyalty to was being attacked. Word spread about a troublesome Jew, a man who had turned all of Israel against the Pharisees, a man who taught his followers to break the Sabbath and many other Jewish customs, and worst of all, a man who claimed himself to be God. It wasn't long before the people tried to make him king, so the leaders took a stand and handed him over to Rome in hopes that the chaos he created would die with him. The plan seemed promising for a few days, but murmurs of a resurrection seized the nation. The body was missing, and the man's disciples swore they saw him alive. The peace that Saul's rabbis had hoped to achieve had only divided Israel further. Saul, the fervent young Hebrew, was tasked with a mission, one that seemed easy with God on his side, but one that, if failed, may spell the end of God's people entirely. He was tasked with crushing the movement known as the Way, by any means necessary. Saul's first target was Jerusalem. He knew that's where the disciples of Jesus were gathered, and he'd gotten word that they'd started a community for all the believers there. This was perfect. He could crush the rampage before anyone outside the walls could catch wind of it. But he'd also heard some troubling stories. Stories of disciples drawing crowds with healings and teaching. And then when the high priest and his associates tried restraining them in prison, they somehow escaped and went right back to their deceptions. He also heard that these false teachings had reached the ears of many foreigners visiting Jerusalem. Witnesses said that each of them heard the message in their own language, and that they planned on taking the message with them to the ends of the earth. Jerusalem was like a dry bush set ablaze in an even drier country, an ember fanned by thousands of tongues, consuming the world and suffocating it in the smoke of this false Messiah. Saul had to see for himself, and he had no intention of negotiating. Saul encountered a man performing unbelievable signs and wonders when he arrived at Jerusalem. He was confronted by a group of Saul's allies, but they were no match for his cunning manipulation of scripture. So they enacted a plan to put him before the Sanhedrin for a trial. The Jewish witnesses testified, saying that this man named Stephen taught that his teacher Jesus would destroy Jerusalem and change the customs handed down to them by Moses. This infuriated Saul and the Jews. And when questioned by the high priest himself, Stephen's speech did nothing but confirm his condemnation. He was dragged out before the people, and though his face glimmered, the words he spoke were the darkest of lies. They charged at him, bombarding him with stones, zealously erasing the uncleanliness from amongst them. Saul guarded the coats of the men pelting the rocks. He grinned his approval as Jesus' message was being destroyed, one disciple at a time. Saul's hatred for this anarchistic gospel surpassed many of his peers and led him to do some brutal but necessary things to the new converts. It wasn't long before Saul was known as the greatest opponent of the gospel, and his name was feared by all who believed the disciples' words. Saul's nation had been thrown into disrepair. His leaders were disrespected, his law was demeaned, and his God was being disregarded. He was a furious man, swearing murderous threats against these false Messiah's disciples. And Stephen's death only increased his fury. After Stephen's stoning, the disciples scattered in fear of him, which would have been good if they hadn't taken their gospel message with them. Saul's mission had gone from easy to near impossible overnight. But even when all hope seemed lost, he remained resolute, relying on what got him this assignment in the first place. Utilizing his profound intellect, he concocted a plan that would give him a decisive advantage in sniffing out the scattered disciples. If this plan worked, the followers of the way would have nowhere left to hide. Saul met with the high priest in Jerusalem and requested letters be delivered to the synagogues in Damascus, saying that anyone belonging to the way must be given up to Saul and imprisoned in Jerusalem. If anyone shared Saul's disdain for the disciples, it was the high priest. So he swiftly agreed and sent Saul to Damascus with a small retinue, letters in hand. The synagogue was the cultural and community hub of the Jewish people. Saul knew this full well. Consequently, being expelled from the synagogue meant losing family, possessions, occupation and belonging. Surely this good news wasn't worth losing everything for. But on his way to Damascus, Saul froze in fear. Light beamed around him, and he was thrown to the ground, trembling. A voice from heaven spoke to him, saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Gripping his face and kneeling in awe, he tried making sense of what was happening. It felt as if he were naked, totally vulnerable, like every sin he'd ever committed rose to the surface of his skin, exposed and burning in the light. "Who are you, Lord?" Saul muttered back, trying to find the words. "I am Jesus who you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." His men were speechless. They heard the voice but didn't see the light. When Saul was helped to his feet, he opened his eyes and nothing entered them. His men guided him the rest of the way to Damascus, where he pondered the encounter he had just had. He had no doubt this was the man who'd started it all, the man who hung on a cross not long ago, and yet stood before him in glory, well and truly alive. But more concerning than that was a personal reality. This man had exposed Saul's sins like never before. Saul lost all righteousness in his presence, and he felt like a leper, unclean in his sight. Little did he know that this Jesus was just getting started with him, and Saul's true trial was about to begin. For 3 days, Saul couldn't see a thing. He didn't eat or drink anything, but waited anxiously to see what Jesus would do with him next. He prayed, but he didn't know what for. During his confused meditation, God met him with a vision. He saw a young disciple approach him. The disciple put his hands on Saul and restored his sight. Saul replayed it over and over, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Meanwhile, the disciples of Damascus heard about Saul's murderous threats and feared his arrival terribly. They knew they'd have to make the most difficult decision of their lives in just a few short days. Ananias was one of them, a disciple just as scared of Saul as the next. But Ananias was set apart. God met him in a vision and instructed him to visit Saul of Tarsus. He'd already arrived in Damascus and had experienced a vision of his own. This instruction seemed suicidal to Ananias. How could he approach the very man who sought to arrest him and expect a peaceful encounter? But the Lord responded to Ananias, "Go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings, and to the people of Israel." I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." At once Ananias met Saul, and placing his trembling hands on Saul, he felt something like scales fall from his eyes. Suddenly the light returned to Saul's eyes, and he was baptized that very day. 3 days in the darkness mightn't seem long, but as Saul reflected, he wondered if all his life had been spent there. In a sincere attempt to please Yahweh, he seemed to have buried his head in legalism and zeal, hiding himself from the true and living Creator God, who was all the while seeking Saul. He took a meeting with his son for Saul to learn who the true God was. And when the scales fell and the light rushed in, it was as if he could see clearly for the first time in his life.